February 1900. In South Africa, British General Lord Roberts was invading the Boer republics. His was the greatest march of a conquering army since Napoleon's march on Moscow. And several thousand Canadians had enlisted to join him in this great adventure.
Goodbye, Dolly, I must leave you, though it breaks my heart to go. Something tells me I am needed at the front to fight the foe. See the boys in blue are marching, and I can no longer stay. Can't I hear the bugle calling? Goodbye, Dolly Gray.
Naar rechts nog!
The Boers of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal Republic were fighting to remain independent. But Lord Roberts was advancing to capture their capital cities and add the Boer republics to the British Empire. Only weeks into the march, Canadians had been in the front lines at Paardeberg, the first major British victory of the war. 5 months after the war began, Lord Roberts rode into the Orange Free State capital of Bloemfontein. He declared it part of the British Empire. President Martinus Steyn escaped in the nick of time from his official residence. Roberts moved in, taking over the president's office and desk. From there, Lord Roberts wrote to Queen Victoria.
The Orange Free State is rapidly settling down. Men are daily laying down their arms and returning to their usual occupations. The Transvaalers will probably hold out, but I trust it will not be very long before the war will be brought to a satisfactory conclusion.
How wrong he was to be. Drastic changes were taking place on the Boer side.
After the capture of Cronje's army at Paardeberg, the Boers realized that they had to change their strategy if they wanted to defeat the British army in South Africa. The Boers decided to get rid of their lagers, in other words, all their wagons and all the other equipment that they carted with them, that they would divide their forces into smaller mobile units, and that they would place the emphasis on the destruction of the British military infrastructure. In other words, attack and destroy the railway lines, capture and destroy bridges, and also try to defeat smaller British units in the field.
The guerrilla attacks left Roberts desperately short of supplies to carry on the war. Sensing that the tide of war was turning, thousands of Boers who had given up and returned home now dug up hidden rifles and rejoined the fight. General Christian de Wet would become world famous as the military genius behind the Boer guerrilla campaign.
The guerrilla war started after the fall of Bloemfontein, when de Wet attacked the waterworks east of Bloemfontein at Sanna's Post, and he ambushed a British column there.
The British convoy moving down this track had no idea they were heading straight for a trap set by General de Wet and 400 men hiding in this gully. As the surprised British wagon drivers descended into the stream bed, they were captured and silently funneled along the gully. By the time the rest of the column discovered the ambush, de Wet had 80 wagons and 400 British prisoners jammed into this gully without firing a shot. Despite British heroics, which won 5 Victoria Crosses, de Wet also captured 7 guns. The British Army fled, leaving de Wet in control of the waterworks that supplied Bloemfontein. De Wet now cut off the city's water supply, leaving Roberts' huge occupying army in desperate straits. Now, Enteric struck Roberts' army with a vengeance. Daily funerals carried off scores of his men, including many Canadians. Enteric fever, or typhoid, is a devastating intestinal infection with high fever, dysentery, vomiting, and delirium. It spreads through dirty water and unsanitary conditions. Water had been severely rationed, so the men had been drinking water anywhere they found it, and the camps had open latrines for thousands of men. In the end, typhoid would kill more men on both sides than all the bullets and artillery shells unleashed during the war. The more fortunate Canadians were looked after by Minnie Affleck, one of only 4 Canadian nurses who had come to South Africa with Canada's first contingent. Canadian patients also received a visit from Dr. Arthur Conan Doyle, the famous creator of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, who would be knighted for his Anglo-Boer War medical services. Battlefield surgeons like Conan Doyle had high praise for the wounds made by the modern Mauser rifles used by the Boers. Unlike the horrendous damage caused by older firearms, the Mauser made entry and exit holes that were small, neat, and clean. And now, for the first time in a war, X-rays were being used to find bullets hidden in the body. But for the most part, conditions in the British military hospitals were awful. Canadian Willie Griesbach was a patient.
There were 7 men in my room, and 4 of them died. The orderlies were merely convalescents and had received no hospital training. Our tableware was tin cups and plates. The British soldier believes that anything that shines is clean. As these soldiers polished the dishes, they spat upon them and polished until they looked like silver. The inspecting officer was greatly impressed. One poor fellow who was dying of wounds and TB used to call me to one side and in a very weak voice would say, "Canadian, don't let them spit on my plate."
Lord Roberts knew he had a major problem. The Boers were all mounted, while most of his men were on foot. He desperately needed the shiploads of mounted colonial troopers who were now arriving with their horses from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But these were not the traditional cavalry who charged with lance and sword and who disdained fighting on foot. Instead, an infantryman was put in the saddle. He carried the standard Lee Medford rifle with the stock in a boot and the barrel fastened with a sling to his shoulder. The result was the mounted infantry, a group of men who would ride to a battle, then dismount to fight on foot. The basic mounted infantry fighting unit was 4 horsemen. During a battle, one man would hold the horses in shelter, while the other 3 fought forward on foot, using rocks and bushes for cover. The horse, formerly a key participant in the fighting, was now reduced to being only a means of transport. Canada's 3rd contingent was formed in early 1900. Lord Strathcona's horse was made up of 600 men and their horses. The regiment was outfitted at the personal expense of Lord Strathcona, Canada's wealthy High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. Strathcona had made his fortune in the Western Canadian fur trade and by promoting the Canadian Pacific Transcontinental Railway. He became famous as the man who drove the last spike. Strathcona's years of experience in the wilds of Canada convinced him that a force of mounted cowboys from the Canadian West would be more than a match for the skilled Boer horsemen in South Africa. Sam Steele was picked to command Lord Strathcona's horse. Steele had lots of active service in the Northwest Mounted Police, including patrolling the Yukon Gold Rush. With him went his bugler, 14-year-old Edwin McCormick. McCormick had a letter of permission from his mother to go off to war. Sam Steele was proud of his men.
They are the very pick of the cowboys, cowpunchers, ranchers, and policemen of the territories and British Columbia. A fine and highly respectable lot. Their physique such as to make them the beau ideal of what a horseman should be.
The commandant of Canada's Royal Military College disagreed.
They're shot through with useless ruffians, the lame, the halt, and the blind.
A recruit described his mates.
They're rovers and adventurers of no fixed occupation, who always turn up when there are heads to be broken.
But this rough and tumble group of Western Canadians would win the highest praise from top British generals. On their way to embark at Halifax, the Strathconas stopped over in Ottawa. They paraded on Parliament Hill before the Governor-General, Lord Minto. On the steps of Parliament, Lady Minto presented them with their regimental colors. Their horses had been recruited in midwinter and locked up in steaming railway cars. Many developed colds on the journey across Canada. On board the Monterey, the colds became pneumonia, and many horses died. By the time they reached South Africa, the Strathcona's horse had lost 162 horses. Said one wag, they should call us Strathcona's Foot. Once ashore, the Strathconas had to wait weeks for new mounts. To relieve the boredom, Steele let his men go into Cape Town, but he was strict. Drunks forfeited a day's pay. Those who got venereal disease lost 2 weeks' pay. Steele considered it a self-inflicted injury. Suddenly, the Strathconas received orders to sail up the coast on a secret mission. They traveled by ship from Cape Town to northern Natal, then rode north through rugged country. Their destination, Kamati Port, on the border between the Transvaal and Portuguese East Africa. Their job, to blow up this huge railway bridge over the Kamati River. All supplies coming from Europe to help the Boer war effort had to cross this bridge. Just hours before the Strathconas reached the bridge, spies reported that the Boers had learned of the plot and now had the bridge heavily guarded. The raid had to be abandoned. An angry Steele blamed lax British security for sabotaging a valiant Canadian effort. It was not until 100 years later that a flood took out a span of this bridge, accomplishing what the Strathconas had planned to do. After a 6-week layover, Lord Robert's army of 38,000 men left Bloemfontein to march 290 miles to Pretoria, capital of the Transvaal Republic. But this time, Roberts would follow the railway so trains could haul the supplies for his army. Colonel Otter and the Royal Canadian Regiment would continue to accompany the march on foot, but 20% of the men were left behind in hospital. The Canadian Mounted Rifles served as Roberts' scouts.
Approximately 30,000 colonial soldiers took part in the Anglo-Boer War on the side of the British Army. I am of the opinion that these foreign colonial troops played a very important role. Most of them were mounted troops, and consequently they could, right from the start, play an important role in harassing the very mobile Boer forces.
The Boers, you must remember, were farmers. They had no military training, but they were hunters. And they knew that you must conceal yourself and camouflage yourself to go shooting game. They employed the same tactics against the imperial forces.
The job of the Canadian Scouts was to flush out any Boers who might be laying in wait for the passing British Army. And that was usually among the rocks of kopje such as the one behind me. 1 or 2 scouts would be detailed to ride pell-mell straight for the kopje to try and draw the fire of the Boers. Pretty thrilling work. If they were fired on, they would ride like the wind for safety, hoping the Boers were poor shots. a larger mounted force, or an artillery barrage would then clear the Boers off the kopje. The way was now clear for the safe passing of the army.
Endless battalions of infantry, very dusty and grimy, guns, bearer companies, colonial horse, generals and their staffs go plodding and jingling by. Long convoys of the different units, groaning and creaking along, the oxen sweating, the dust whirling, the African drivers yelling, and the long whips going like pistol shots. The whole thing suggests more of a national migration than the march of an army.
At every river crossing, the Boers tried to stop the British Army. Here on the Vet River at Coetzee's Drift, General Roberts ordered the Canadians to seize the crossing. Lieutenants Turner and Borden of the Royal Canadian Dragoons swam back and forth across the river, drawing the fire of the Boers who were on the hills of the North Shore. Other Canadians seized the crossing down below.
Richard Turner received the Distinguished Service Order, the Empire's second highest medal for bravery. Harold Borden, the son of Canada's Minister of Militia, was brought to Lord Roberts' attention for intrepid and gallant conduct. The British Army could move on again. Lord Roberts, seen here riding up the Zand River drift, desperately wanted to trap the Boers, but he couldn't catch them. No matter how fast his army moved, the Boers moved faster.
They were retreating, yet it was never a rout. They slip away in the most extraordinary manner.
To slow the British down, the Boers blew up bridges and tore up railway lines. These had to be repaired before food and supplies could be brought up for the army. Soldiers became desperate to find enough to eat. The Canadians became experts at foraging. George Smith wrote to his parents,
"As fast as we come up the country, we loot the farms. We've had chicken soup every night for the last week, besides honey and butter. If we lived on government rations, we would starve in about a week."
While there was a strict order against looting, there was a breakdown in the supply system and no meat was coming forward. So we learned how to shoot a steer, skin it, and cut it up in jig time. Another fellow and I ate a whole sheep one night, for the simple reason that we had no hardtack or anything to go with it.
When a Canadian was caught stealing a chicken, the press back home was horrified to learn that he could face execution. He was let off, but Canadian officers warned their men not to get caught again. As the British Army swept across the countryside, more and more Boer families were caught up in the fighting. At Wittelsburg, a battle raged around the Erasmus farmhouse.
Here are 3 holes in our family home. This was made by British cannon fire during the Anglo-Boer War in 1900. My great-grandfather lived in this house. During the battle, he did not want to leave the house, and he had to be carried bodily out of the house to safety.
During the battle, the grass caught fire and trapped many wounded British soldiers.
My father served with the Grenadier Guards. He was very severely wounded at Wittelsburg here. He had 10 wounds and was burnt in the Veld fire that ensued, and the Boers actually came through, pulled him out of the fire, acted like Christians, and saved his life. I always used to say that if I was alive in the year 2000, I would want to come to Senekal to honor my father, who really would have lost his life had it not been for the Boers who pulled him out the fire.
Lord Robert's army swallowed horses like a modern army gulps gasoline. Replacement horses came by the tens of thousands from India, Burma, Argentina, and Hungary. The big Canadian horses were the envy of the British, but the horses were overloaded, overworked, and underfed, drank contaminated water, and were overcome by sore feet, lameness, and disease. A fully equipped trooper came with a saddle that weighed 35 pounds and carried some 50 pounds of gear. He had 2 blankets under the saddle, an oil sheet, greatcoat or cavalry cloak, curry comb and brush, a hay net stuffed with hay, a haversack with shaving kit, soap, towel, and emergency rations, plus a full water bottle, a rifle, and ammunition. Horses became so broken down that men could hang their helmets on the protruding bones. Willie Griesbach and his beloved riding horse had been partners long before they left Alberta to go to war.
The amount of love that a horseman can lavish on his horse is one of the most beautiful things in soldiering. But the time came when I had to give up my horse. He had become practically a skeleton. His back was covered with stinking sores, and I could do nothing for him. If I turned him loose, someone else would try to get a few days' work out of him. I took him out into the veldt, out of sight, and shot him. I put my arm around his neck and tried to explain things to him. He promptly laid down. There was in his manner something apologetic. I rubbed his eyes and induced him to put his head down. He seemed to say, "I am very tired." Like an assassin, I completed the job and left him to his rest. I think he had a suspicion of what I was going to do. At times, and in certain humors throughout the years that have passed, I see his reproachful brown eyes as they looked up at me before I put him to sleep.
Of the thousands of Canadian horses taken to South Africa, none would ever return to Canada. During the war, almost 500,000 horses would die while serving in the British Army. By May, Mafeking was the only British town still surrounded by the Boers. Their Long Tom was shelling the town daily, but the garrison commander, Colonel Baden-Powell, refused to surrender. After 6 months of siege, the white people in Mafeking were still in good health, but the 7,000 Africans were starving.
The blacks definitely felt the brunt of war on their backs. They were sucked into a tornado, a conflict between whites in South Africa. They had nothing to do with this conflict, but it was a total war, and therefore they were sucked into it.
During the war, both Britain and Boer avoided arming black Africans because both feared they might turn the guns on whites. But in Mafeking, Baden-Powell armed the blacks and depended on them to play a key role in defending the town.
At first, the siege wasn't expected to last very long, and there were huge supplies of food in the town. But as it dragged on, Baden-Powell was forced to ration the food to everyone. Unfortunately, perhaps, he was rather discriminatory in the rationing of food to the black people of Mafeking, who he actually tried to starve in order to force them to get out, and therefore reduce the hungry mouths that were in the town.
So in fact, he actually chased them out of the town, but the Boers then chased them back again, aggravating the food shortage in the town. Many, many more black people died from starvation than was the case amongst the whites. As a matter of fact, I will be very surprised to find that any of the whites actually died of starvation during any of these sieges.
To feed their families, Africans had to steal. This man was brought up before one of Baden-Powell's courts, charged with stealing a goat. He was condemned to death. But help was on the way. Outside Mafeking, Colonel Plumer's army was waiting for the arrival of the Canadian artillery. Plumer was counting on the punch of the Canadian guns to break through the ring of Boers surrounding the town. Sea Battery of the Royal Canadian Artillery traveled 2,000 miles by ship from Cape Town to Beira, then by train into the fever-infested interior many called the white man's grave. Sometimes the grade was so steep, everyone had to get out and push. When the tracks ended, they went by wagon and on foot for 300 miles through the wilderness of Rhodesia. The Canadians traveled for 4 weeks to bring in their 6 12-pounder guns. An armored train took them the last 400 miles to join up with Colonel Plumer outside Mafeking. On the morning of May 16th, the Canadian guns went into action in a cornfield and knocked out the Boer guns one by one. By late afternoon, the Boers were in retreat. Canadian guns had lifted the siege of Mafeking. To honor the Canadian contribution, Baden-Powell decreed that on Mafeking's first day of liberation, the garrison's secret password would be Canada. In every corner of the British Empire, crowds went wild with jubilation. As the main British army approached Pretoria, General Charles Warren set out to catch a Boer commando that was raiding in northwest Cape Colony. Warren was still smarting from his disastrous defeat at Spion Kop 4 months earlier. A battery of Canadian artillery under Major Ogilvie and a troop of Canadian scouts led by Captain Mackey went along. Bombastic Canadian freelance soldier Sam Hughes was Warren's chief intelligence officer. The hatless Hughes, shown here interrogating African spies, was an outspoken member of Canada's Parliament, a newspaper publisher, and a militia officer. When he was turned down for service in Canada's first contingent because of age, he had come to South Africa on his own and found a job with the British Army. One evening, Warren chose a camp at a farm called Faber's Put. The Canadians put their horses into this stone kraal. It was a poor site for a camp, surrounded by bushes and low ridges. Warren posted only 4 pickets to guard a camp of 700 men. Sam Hughes and Captain Mackey settled themselves into this farmhouse for the night. As the men slept, the Boer commando they were chasing quietly surrounded the British camp and set up their guns. Just before dawn, a picket's warning shot awoke the camp.
When they heard the firing outside, Sam Hughes and Captain Mackey came roaring out the front door of this farmhouse where they'd been sleeping. They were in their underwear. They had no boots on, but their guns were blazing, Sam Hughes used to say later. They were shooting at the Boers who were trying to stampede the horses out of the corral. In later life, Hughes was to claim he deserved the Victoria Cross for this heroic action. The 4 Canadian guns were parked right here beside the kraal. During the night when the firing started, Major Ogilvie and his men got up and ran to man the guns and aim them at the Boers who were attacking the kraal on the far side. Bullets were flying everywhere. William Latimer became the first battlefield casualty of the Royal Canadian Field Artillery. Later, the Canadian gunners aimed over the heads of the Boers at their horses. The Boers, fearing that their only means of escape would be cut off, retreated back to their horses and fled the scene. The Battle of Faber's Put was over.
23 British soldiers were dead. It was one of the Canadian artillery's fiercest fights of the war.
No seasoned troops could have been steadier than these young Canadian gunners, obeying every order as quietly as on parade.
General Warren praised the Canadians, but Sam Hughes was outraged that so many soldiers had died needlessly because of the negligence of British officers. He wrote a scathing article denouncing Warren's choice of campsite and the lack of adequate sentries. He sent it to newspapers in Cape Town and Canada. When Warren heard about the public criticism from his chief intelligence officer, he was furious. The British High Command sent the headstrong Sam Hughes back to Canada in disgrace. A few years later, Sam Hughes would resurface as Canada's Minister of War during World War I. As Lord Roberts' army neared the Transvaal capital of Pretoria, resistance collapsed on all sides. At his modest house in Pretoria, President Paul Kruger prepared to abandon his home to the invading army. Then he climbed into his official carriage for the last time. With a heavy heart, Paul Kruger bade a final farewell to his invalid wife. They would never see each other again.
Won't be with you till we meet again.
Kruger took the train east down the line towards the Portuguese frontier with most of his government officials. A railway car would be his home and the seat of the Transvaal government for months to come. Many Boer generals were now convinced that it was hopeless to continue fighting. Even Christian de Wet had become totally disheartened during the retreat north.
To flee, what could be more bitter than that? Many a time, when I was forced to yield to the enemy, I felt so degraded that I could scarcely look a child in the face. But how could we make a stand, outnumbered 12 to 1?
On June 5th, 1900, Lord Roberts' army entered Pretoria unopposed. It was a proud moment for Canadian Hart McHarg.
Ragged and tanned, footsore and weary, dirty and gaunt, we trudged along the western road leading into the square, past Paul Kruger's house. We squared our shoulders, chucked out our chests, and put all the ginger we could into our step. We stood on June 5th as the representatives of the Canadian people in the Grand Army of the British Empire, in the surrendered capital of the enemy. If anyone asks me what I consider the greatest occasion in my life, I say that it was when I marched past Lord Roberts in Pretoria with the Royal Canadian Regiment.
The next day, Willie Griesbach arrived with the Canadian Mounted Rifles.
I don't believe any of us had washed for about a week, and the dust was thick on us. Our clothes were full of holes, and the stuff we carried on our horses was enough to kill the poor animals. There were frying pans, tea kettles, pots and pails, bags of flour and cornmeal, a piece of meat tied to one side, and maybe a bag of oranges tied to the other. And none of it was government issue.
The men were sure the war was over and they were going home. Canadian George Smith wrote to his parents,
"Every man is sick of it. I've had all I want and am ready to go back and work."
And the memorabilia trade was already grinding out souvenir silks, celebrating the coming peace that was certain now that Pretoria was occupied. But the war was far from over.
Most Afrikaners say my great-grandfather was the siel van die vryheidsstryd, the soul of this freedom struggle. Because after Pretoria fell, the Transvaalers lost heart. And they started negotiating without consulting my great-grandfather. When he heard it, he was furious. And he contacted them and told them, if they want to give up, they must do so, but the Free State will continue the struggle. And that made them decide to break off all negotiations with the imperial forces and resume the struggle for independence.
Suddenly, Boer commandos were everywhere, ripping up railway tracks, attacking trains, tearing down telegraph lines, and harassing British patrols. Out of nowhere, General de Wet suddenly reappeared and led several spectacular guerrilla raids. He captured almost 1,000 British soldiers.
There the British saw that they can take the towns and the cities. But what did de Wet tell them? De Wet told them by his actions, you can take the towns and the cities, but the veld will remain Republican.
Lord Roberts now realized that capturing capital cities and towns was not enough. To end the war, he would have to catch the Boer leaders who inspired the guerrilla war and destroy their armies in the field.
The British fought the Boers, but they also fought the wide open spaces of South Africa. And consequently, they needed mobile troops, and in due course, they in fact divided their army into smaller mobile columns or anti-commando units.
As a result, the colonial mounted troops from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand began to play a role far out of proportion to their numbers. They were sent out to catch the Boer commandos who were spreading like wildfire across the veld. On July 6th, several Strathconas were attacked by a Boer commando. During the skirmish, Sergeant Arthur Richardson charged into the heavy rifle fire, pulled a wounded comrade up behind him onto his horse, and galloped him to safety. For his bravery, Richardson was awarded Canada's first Victoria Cross of the war. A few days later, Canadians had tragic news. While his men were rescuing the Royal Irish Fusiliers from a deadly trap, Lieutenant Harold Borden stood up to spy on the Boer positions. He was shot by a sniper. Canada's Minister of Militia, Frederick Borden, the strongest supporter of Canadian participation in the war, had lost his only son in far-off Africa. All of Canada mourned his loss. General Christian de Wet became an international hero, swooping down on British units, then disappearing into the veld. His men were honed for instant response. Sentries who slept on duty were punished by being put on an anthill and shot if they moved.
Well, he was a Christian, like all the old Boer generals. He was not ruthless or heartless. He was just possessed with a determination to preserve our independence.
A month after Lord Roberts captured Pretoria, de Wet, President Steyn, and 8,000 survivors of the Free State Army gathered to reorganize here in the mountains of the Eastern Orange Free State. Lord Roberts sent his generals to seal the passes and trap the Boers inside this mountain fortress, but the ponderous British columns were too slow. One night, de Wet and President Steyn escaped through an unguarded pass with 2,500 men in a convoy 3 miles long. But the rest were trapped and had to surrender. The capture of 5,000 Boers here at Surrender Hill was the greatest Boer defeat since Paardeberg 5 months earlier.
It happened here on Surrender Hill. As British officers lined their horses along the sides, they watched as thousands of Boers and hundreds of wagons came down this track to surrender to the British. For them, the war was over. As the Boers came down Surrender Hill, the British made them dump their weapons in this spot. The Boers piled up their rifles, their bandoliers, pistols, and their ammunition, and the British set them on fire. Witnesses said the fire burned day and night for days. Over the past 100 years, not a single blade of grass has ever grown on this spot. It's as if the salt from generations of tears has made it impossible for anything ever to grow here again.
General de Wet was outraged when he received news of the surrender.
It was nothing short of an act of murder. One could gnash one's teeth to think that a nation should so readily rush to its own ruin.
Several thousand Boers were shipped as prisoners of war to the British colonies of Ceylon and Bermuda.
My grandfather surrendered there at Surrender Hill, and he was caught there and taken prison. So he was sent to Bermuda as a prisoner of war, and he stayed there for 2 years. And he made this little wooden box in Bermuda, and he wrote there, Bermuda 1902, in remembrance, best thoughts of my wife, Anna Erasmus. She stayed here with a little child under the age of 2 years. He have been 2 years away, and he don't know what happened to her, what had happened on the farm. So this little wooden box, this is very precious for me, for my family.
Before the war was over, thousands more would be sent into exile.
This statue was erected for the 32,000 Boer prisoners of war who were sent away to Bermuda, St. Helena, Ceylon and Sri Lanka. Almost 1,000 of them died and never returned to their country again. The youngest boy who was captured, his name was Pieter Delport, and he was only 6 years of age. And the oldest man who was captured was Jacobus Fick, in the age of 89 years.
In the eastern Transvaal, Sam Steele and the Strathcona's horse were scouts for General Buller, the former commander-in-chief. Buller was trying to catch the brilliant Boer general Louis Botha, who only months before had crushed his armies at Colenso and Spionkop. But the rugged terrain here was ideal for the guerrilla hit-and-run tactics of the Boers. Early in September, Sam Steele and the Strathconas rode up this valley. They camped at a farm called Badfontein. Steele had grown increasingly frustrated by what he saw as the incompetence of many of his British superior officers.
Sam Steele was mad. He had placed his lookout scouts along this ridge where I'm standing, even though it was far from the British camp, which lay beyond the farm buildings in the valley. He knew this position was vital for the defense of the camp. Now, over his strongest objections, a British staff officer ordered him to move his men back to a ridge much closer to the camp. In the morning, the Boers were here, holding a ridge the Canadians had been ordered to abandon. All day long, the Boers bombarded the British in the valley. In the end, Steele was ordered to have the Strathconas find a way to regain this ridge, which Steele hadn't wanted to give up in the first place. The Boers opened fire against the Canadians. Six of Steele's men died. It was the worst day of casualties for Strathcona's horse during the entire war. Sam Steele's men lie today in this small cemetery on the same ridge where they fought and died.
Steele was especially overcome with the death of Sergeant Brothers.
He was an only son who had come out of the Yukon 600 miles on the ice to Skagway to join the battalion. He had no superior as a keen, brave, and patriotic man.
The Strathconas now helped to chase the Boer commandos through these mountain passes as they retreated east along the railway. The British finally pushed Louis Botha's commandos against the border with Portuguese East Africa. Roberts now expected a mass surrender like Paardeberg and Surrender Hill, but all he found was a huge bonfire of 1,500 railway cars full of supplies that the Boers had set on fire to keep them out of British hands. Louis Botha and his Boers had vanished back into the high country. A year after the war had broken out, Lord Roberts announced that it was practically over. He could not have guessed that the longest and most bitter part was yet to come.